Welcome to Intelligence Squared. Thank you very much to Hannah. Now, I'm sat between a politician who's often described as a rock star and a rock star who's an artist, an activist, and a rock star. So it has to be said, because I don't think I'll ever get the chance again. Hello, London! I'm undoubtedly playing the role of gooseberry tonight because Brian Eno and Yanis Varoufakis are long-standing friends. Their shared interest in politics and ideas, both practical and philosophical, is more, I think, than just bar-side banter. They're both also involved in a political project. Yanis is co-founder of DiEM25, the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, and Brian's a leading member of it, and I think some of the movement's ideas may actually come up and get an airing tonight. So the introductions. Now, Yanis was absolutely certain that you'd know all this anyway, but I'm going to remind you anyway. He's an academic and former Greek finance minister, failed Greek finance minister in his words. I think it would be fair to say he defies pretty much every finance minister stereotype you've ever heard. A leather jacket and a motorbike, they're his sort of trademark style. His profile soared after he took office amid the Greek financial crisis in 2015, and at the time he described the austerity measures that were being prescribed for Greece as fiscal waterboarding and terrorism. These days, Yanis is a member of the Greek Parliament and he's a professor of economics at the University of Athens, as well as a visiting professor of political economy here at King's College in London. Brian Eno is a musician and an activist who's woven, I think it's fair to say, into the soundtrack of many of our lives, certainly mine. He's probably one of contemporary music's most influential and innovative figures. He began his career playing synth with Roxy Music in the 1970s, and after leaving the band, I think in 1973, he developed what he called ambient music, a sort of cloud of sound, an idea that's entered very much into the mainstream and has been widely copied ever since. He's worked with artists including David Bowie, Talking Heads, Grace Jones, and Damon Albarn. Now, Brian and Yanis, I dare say you have better things to do than watching a programme called Through the Keyhole. Have either of you ever seen that? No? Okay, I'm kind of quite pleased you haven't, actually. Anyway, it was presented by...
I don't watch television.
No, I'm relieved. This is... if you
I
were
listen to radio.
Good. Well, I'm even more pleased about that.
A lot of your programmes as well.
Anyway, it was presented by...
Sucking up to the moderator.
She worked that out. It's presented by a guy called Lloyd Grossman, who was a Canadian with a really strangled accent. And basically, it used to take us around a celebrity home. And it was sheer voyeurism. There was no other way of describing it. Well, we want to have an element of that tonight. I want you to pretend that the two of you are kind of having a bit of a, you're hanging out, you're having a bit of a bar-side chat. We're not really here. Imagine that we're kind of at the back of the bar washing the glasses, right? We're not here. And we will all get to join in a bit later because you'll get to ask questions and so will I. So what happens when Brian and Yanis, sort of shoot the breeze, down a glass of something or two? What do you talk about? What are the biggest problems facing us right now? And we can talk a bit about solutions. And let's start by talking about how we fit in. Brian, as individuals, as a society, what are we facing as problems and what are the issues about individuality versus society?
Well, I should first of all say that we mostly meet in front of a large audience.
Ruin that then.
It's true, we often do meet in this kind of situation, because he lives in Greece and I live here. Somebody has to pay the airfare, But, well, I suppose the thing that has been obsessing me for quite a few years is where does creativity come from? Where does intelligence come from? And I'm more and more convinced it comes out of communities rather than, as we tend to think, out of individuals. It comes out of a whole sort of quagmire, a whole ecology of thinking and doing. Some of it looks like intellectual work, some of it doesn't, but it's what produces new ideas. So I often say now that new ideas are usually articulated by one person, but they're nearly always generated by a lot of people. And we tend to reward that one person at the expense of the other people. I've been a beneficiary of that reward system, but I'm more and more suspicious of it.
And do you think that the interaction of the individual with groups of people is the crucial part there? I'm thinking about the band, the way a rock band works, the world that you work in. What is that interaction?
Well, it's very interesting. I often use the word chemistry, which is a word everybody uses, but I mean it in a very literal sense. If you take iron, 100% iron, you have iron, there's something that's brittle, heavy, and so on. If you add 4% of carbon to it, you get something called steel, and that's a quite different material. And very often the chemistry of bands is like that there's one person who makes a lot of noise and seems to be the leader. And there's very often one other person who doesn't make very much noise, but actually is equally indispensable. And I find that's true in all sorts of social situations as well. One of the things that came to interest me was those creative situations called salons, which very much were part of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Salons were nearly always large groups of people, many of whom don't remain in the history books, but actually were part of the ecology, including particularly the hostesses who usually were putting these salons on and bringing people together.
Mrs. Dalloway.
Yes, yeah.
Yanis, come on. The individual and ideas and creativity and solutions.
Listening to Brian, by the way, when we are on our own, we usually have the same kind of conversation. So either we're very interesting or we're exceedingly boring.
Narrow-minded.
We do. This is the kind of thing we're talking about, you know.
Yeah.
Why do people make art? This is something that, you know, we've spent hours talking about. Regarding the individual, allow me to come to the subject from my own trauma of being an economist. Because anybody who has had the tough luck of having studied economics, even very little economics, you will recall that the first page of the introductory textbook defines the rational person, Homo economicus. It's always a he, because only a male could be so deprived and depraved. So the individual is defined in economics as a bundle of preferences, seeking satisfaction, given constraints. And you're rational to the extent that you maximize your preference satisfaction given the amount of money you have, what other people who appear in the scene of economic theory as an obstacle. So community, instead of being empowering, is what Jean-Paul Sartre used to say, other people are hell. But he meant it in an existentialist way. The economists actually mean it literally. Now, this is, of course, effectively, what you have is a Robinson Crusoe approach to the economy. If you look at the Bank of England's econometric models that the Bank of England uses in order to predict inflation, unemployment, Brexit, as if they can ever predict what will happen with Brexit, given that there is a sample of 0 to work with. But anyway, so all these models are predicated upon the assumption that the economy is founded on Robinson Crusoe and his clones. They have no relationship except that through the market mechanism, so buying and selling. No one influences anyone. There's no money and there's no debt. Because you cannot have money without a community. It's like language. Remember what Wittgenstein used to say? There can be no such thing as a private language. Language is something we create together. If you're a single person on a planet and you've grown up on your own, there's no way you can have a language unless somebody taught it to you. So this rather sad depiction of the individual, which, by the way, is a savage, is at the heart of the way in which mainstream economics thinks about the world. And one may ask the question, so why is this the case? Are they not philosophically sophisticated enough? No, the answer is that there's a lot of money in it. Because the whole point about mainstream economics is to justify capitalism. And capitalism justifies itself on the basis of the fiction that wealth is something that is produced individually. And then the state comes and taxes it, when it's exactly the opposite. Wealth is produced socially, collectively, and then it's privatized. So this juxtaposition between the individual and the collective, This is the dominant ideology which supports profit-making and a particular kind of class structure. It's the sermons, it's the religion, it's the theory. It plays exactly the same role that in the Middle Ages the bishop played in legitimizing the power of the emperor, of the lord, of the baron, of the king. And what we need to do, we need to dissolve it. And Brian gave me a fantastic idea of how this is dissolved. Think about the economist's model of competition, right? It's a bit like a kind of Olympic sport where my victory is your loss. But a far more interesting model of what happens in the world is the band, where you've got highly individualistic people usually on the stage. But what's going on is while at the same time each one of them trying to prove to the audience and to each other and to themselves that they're the best of the lot, unless there is the chemistry, unless there is the synergy, each one of them just creates noise.
So, carrying on from that, I would say that the other limitation of conventional economics or classical economics is not only that it's focused on the individual rather than the community, but it also has this notion of externalities, so that things that can't be monetized, things that can't be expressed in terms of money, are not considered part of the picture. You don't even think about them. So that leaves out at least two very important worlds. One is the environment. If it isn't priceable, you don't count it. It's a resource for you to use. And the other is caring. All the things that traditionally women did and still do, which aren't paid for. So you know the classical story that if I have a housekeeper and I marry her, I've actually reduced the GDP by doing that. Because there's no longer a transaction of money between me and her. So that seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But that is still the basis of economics. We're still calculating GDP on the basis only of exchange of money.
Is that a flaw of economics, or is that a flaw of politics?
Any attempt to distinguish between economics and politics, which economists, invest immense energy in making that distinction, any such attempt leads to really very stupid economics and toxic politics. Look, think about it, buying a tub of yogurt is a political act in a sense that you are channeling resources to particular individuals, to particular companies, to a particular foodstuff. That is a political choice in a way. It is something that shapes society to a tiny little extent. Even Margaret Thatcher acknowledged that. Remember when she was towards the end of her career as Prime Minister, her tenure as Prime Minister, she had that moment of clarity when she said something that was correct and not particularly misanthropic. In opposing...
Only happened once, I think.
It happened a few times by accident. But she was extremely smart. So smart people, if they keep talking, they will say something profound at some point. But she made the point in opposing the Eurozone and the European Central Bank that was in the making at the time. You remember one of the last speeches in Parliament, I think it was Prime Minister's question time, she said, "Who controls monetary policy and interest rates controls the politics of Europe." There you are. Any attempt to distinguish politics from economics is bunk.
In which case, if you're talking about the project that is Europe and the politics and economics that underpins it, you're very critical of the way in which Europe functions right now, and we've been having our own rather vigorous debate. Is it the politics and economics? Is it the individuals? Is it the way in which it was set up? Where do you even begin on that?
Well, look, I think most of you to be here know that we supported Remain, a radical Remain, Okay, we said the European Union sucks, it's really anti-democratic, but you should stay in and we should fix it together. And there is no incoherence involved in this. It's like saying, I hate the Prime Minister of this country because I love this country. There's nothing in contradiction here, right? So, having said that, this is for full disclosure purposes. Look, my view about the European Union is that it had a very bad start. In 1950, behind all the lofty ideals, which were great, wanting to end all wars on the continent of Europe and bring people together, that was all great. But if you look at the construction, it was a cartel of big business. The first name for the European Union was the European Community for Coal and Steel, like OPEC. And the whole point was to limit competition in order to maximize the profits of these big businesses. And then they co-opted the French farmers, they gave them a cut of the industrialists' profits. When you create a kind of state apparatus in the image of a cartel, this is, by definition, the opposite of democracy.
People might talk about cooperation, efficiency, words like that, perhaps?
Well, they can talk about, transhumanism for all I care. The fact is that the bureaucracy in Brussels was put there in order to serve the interests of big business and to keep the riffraff, the demos, out of any democratic process, and effectively to take decision-making capacities from democratically elected governments and throw them into this hole of this cartel. Okay, that doesn't sound like a great eulogy for the EU.
It doesn't sound like you're a fan.
So Tony Benn was right to oppose Britain's entry into the European Common Market, in my view. Mm-hmm. But it's one thing to say we should not have gotten into this cartel. It's quite another thing to say 43 years later that we should get out. Because during those 43 years, you have all sorts of social norms that have emerged. You have Erasmus, you have whole layers of legislation, you have industry standards, you have environmental protection standards, you have worker protection standards. It's not just a cartel, it is something much bigger than that. And it is impossible to disentangle yourself from this without creating toxic politics in your country and also precipitating a dynamic within the European Union which will turn the European Union into a far more aggressive continent, which is not bad for you, given that whatever you do, you cannot sail away from this part of the world and sail towards the United States or China, despite what Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson may want. So my view of Europe is, this is how it started. The crisis we see in the euro, the crisis of legitimacy of the European Union, is a natural repercussion of its original architecture as a cartel. What we must now do is transform it and democratize it. This is why DiEM25 began in 2016 with the slogan, the EU will be democratized or it will disintegrate. And what we are trying to do is to prevent its disintegration, because it's going to have huge political, economic, social, aesthetic, cultural costs upon all of us, by democratizing it, by putting the demos into what is supposed to be European democracy.
Brian, I wonder if for you, when you think about climate change, and I'm going to turn a little bit of a corner because I'm anxious to make sure we have enough time for questions. When you think about climate change then, is the EU the vehicle within which you can tackle that? This big undemocratic cartel, as Yanis describes it?
Well, it's certainly a much better vehicle than Britain on its own, I think, for sure. It already has started making steps in that direction. And in fact, we have already been sharing in those. And probably we will now be in the process of trying to revoke them if we do Brexit. But the more important issue for me is thinking, where does power actually lie? And I think what has happened in the last few years, because of the joint shock of Trump and Brexit, is that people have started empowering themselves again. They've started becoming empowered. I mean, I'm particularly aware of this in America because I have quite a lot of American friends who are intellectuals who for years and years would have absolutely nothing to do with politics. They were sort of libertarians who thought politics is a sort of old business. Technology actually is moving much faster than politics, and technology actually predicates our politics. So suddenly they're thinking, oh, pulling out of politics wasn't such a smart move. It just left the ground to people like Trump. So same thing over here, I think. Suddenly we're all engaged in a way again. And in fact, one of the reasons I do things like this is because I want to say to people, actually anybody can be engaged. You don't have to have come from a political background. What you have to want to do is to take hold of what power you can get hold of and do something with it. And I think the way that power structures change is actually quite subtle. I think that the existing power structure becomes more and more fossilized. It becomes less and less able to respond to the people it's supposed to be governing. You can see this very clearly, I think, happening both here and in America. So what happens then is those people have to make ad hoc arrangements themselves and get things done themselves. Bit by bit, they become the government. That carapace, that fossilized carapace still exists, and we still have to pay for them, just like we still pay for the monarchy, and we still pay for the church, and we still pay for all these layers of carapace that we have above us. But the real work of social change is being made by people, often working voluntarily, actually. People who belong to NGOs, who are in neighborhood groups to change things, to improve the local school, or in big organizations like Greenpeace and so on. But it's those people who are propelling change now, much more than politicians who are generally sort of obstructing it by their fossilizedness.
But isn't there a tension between that vision and what Yanis is describing? Can you re-democratize a fossilized carapace, if that's what we're talking about?
Yes,
I think I have one thing I'd like to say about that, about the idea of democracy. There's a little-known American political scientist who has the unfortunate name Charles Schnattschneider. I'm sure that's why he's so little known, because nobody can remember it. And he said a really wonderful thing. He said, democracy is a process for people who are not certain that they're right. And I think the most interesting thing about the possibility of democracy is that you kind of you crowdsource, basically. You draw intelligence from everywhere. And that's exactly what we haven't been doing for the last few years. We've individualized politics to such an extent that, we end up with these sort of charismatic figures like Trump and Johnson and Thatcher. That isn't the way to go.
First, on the Green New Deal and the European Union. I have no trust in the European Union's tendency to implement a Green New Deal the way its bureaucracy and politics is structured. It will not happen. They will make all the right noises because the EU is fantastic at labels, packaging, euphemisms, and all that hides inactivity, inaction. Look at Germany, for instance. It's amazing that there's a country that is swimming in surpluses. It's got a budget surplus, a trade surplus, a surplus of corporate savings, of household savings, and they're not investing in anything serious. I mean, their infrastructure is crumbling. They're still using lignite. I mean, it's pathetic, right? But the European Union has the instruments that could be pressed into the service of a genuine Green New Deal, and I'll give numbers now, 500 billion pounds every year, at least. At least. This is the minimum we need in Europe. 500 to 800 billion pounds every year. It sounds like a lot of money. It is not. Do you know how much money is swashing around in the City of London doing nothing, being uninvested? It's about £1 trillion. So only in London. Imagine in the whole of Europe. It's about 4.5 trillion in Europe. Excess savings, liquidity, doing nothing other than bidding up house prices and not doing what. But the European Union has the institutions who have the European Investment Bank, which sounds boring, and it is boring, and it is in Luxembourg, of all places.
That's really boring.
But
is anybody here from Luxembourg? I'm sorry.
But do you know, it's 4 times the size of the World Bank. It has the capacity to energize all this excess liquidity, especially if you have an alliance between the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, under a Labour government, allow me to, make a party political broadcast here. Go, Jeremy. But if you have an alliance between the Central Bank of Europe, of Britain, of Denmark, of Sweden, and the European Investment Bank, a new public investment bank that you need in this country, the equivalent in Germany, KfW, right? You could really affect and implement a meaningful, substantial Green New Deal. But to do this, to utilize those institutions, you need the demos to rise up. And it will not be a question of persuading politicians that they are wrong. It's a question of overthrowing them, replacing them. So, the Extinction Rebellion people, the Fridays for Future people, they have to take over politics and not disintegrate the European Union, but use those wonderful instruments that are there, sitting, doing nothing, or very little, that is useful, and press them into service. And one last thing, allow me to say. Look, I have a message for you folks. Stop whinging. Brexit has been a very good thing for you. Not getting out of the European Union, but it has reinvigorated democratic politics in this country. People talk politics again. Youngsters are interested in politics again. Now, that is a breath of fresh air. That is something to harness its energy, not in order to get out of the European Union, but in order to, for instance, everybody now sees that there is a majestic disconnect between Parliament and the people, between the elites and the people. Okay? Fine. Do not surrender this to the Farages of the world. Make sure that this becomes a good reason to reconsider the electoral system, the fraudulent first past the post, which will never allow this country to be fully democratic. You need assemblies like that to grow and to become citizens' assemblies, to discuss again the constitution of the United Kingdom that needs to be written down and needs to be reconsidered. You need an English parliament. You will decide what you need. But this is a fantastic moment in British history. And just to conclude, there are two ways of being nationalistic. One is to adopt, the exceptionalism mantra, that our country is exceptional, it is much better than other countries, and so on. But there is another way of being a nationalist, and this is one we must avoid. Inverted exceptionalism. Our country is the worst. Look, the political system has broken down. Brexit has proven nothing is working. We are the worst of the worst. No, that is another kind of nationalism. We are not that special. You're not worse than the Germans, the Greeks, the French. Our democracies are in trouble. That's why we need to get together at the European level, at the international level, to put the demos back into democracy. And you're doing a good job. This is a good start. Keep going.
There's so much I want to unpick there. I'm not going to be able to unpick it all, but one small point before I actually want us to go back a little bit as well. I was interested that you used the people versus the parliament kind of narrative, because many people reject that. They see that as it's not about a disconnect between parliament and the people.
It's a huge disconnect. You have first past the post. Thatcher used to win election after election after election with a minority. Okay, that's not democracy. But you need to change that system.
Isn't the debate and the tension right now about putting in place a referendum into a political setup that is a representative democracy, and those two things sit very uncomfortably next to each other?
Well, that's only because your democracy has been stunted by first past the post, and the fact that you only had 3 referenda. The Swiss have referenda every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. They incorporate the referendum process perfectly and beautifully with parliamentary democracy.
One of the important things, of course, is that they actually explain what you're voting about in each of those referenda.
And they keep having them, so they can keep changing their minds and so on. It's not, you have one referendum and that's it. Finished. The problem with the second referendum that I feared in the last couple of years, and that's why I was never in favor of the second referendum, was that it would probably be the last. If it ever happened, it would be so toxic, it would be probably boycotted by leavers, and then there wouldn't be another referendum. I think the referenda are important. I also think that they need to be combined. The Irish example with the referendum on abortion rights was crucial, because there you saw how a parliament was locked into a debate. It could not escape from the straitjacket that it had found itself in. And what unlocked it was a citizens' assembly, which prepared the public for a referendum that was well-informed, and then that went hand in hand with parliament. So we need to combine parliament, referenda, citizens' assemblies.
Okay, let's move on a little bit, because I don't want to spend all the time talking about the issues around Brexit. But you also talked about the Green New Deal and the need for the demos to rise up and push this idea forward. What about co-opting the bankers? Mark Carney's talked recently on several occasions about the importance of green issues to business, and that actually it should become fundamental to the ways in which businesses see themselves and their future, and indeed giving the best to their shareholders or whatever their priority is. Is that a way forward?
I have a very high regard for Mark. He didn't say that. He didn't talk about co-opting the bankers, because Mark Carney is too clever to suggest that, because he knows that they cannot be co-opted to a good cause. Right? What he said is, if you do not move towards sustainable investments, you're going to go bankrupt. But they will not. It's against their nature to do anything good. So allow me to be very specific. We're here in London. We're not far away from the City of London. I'm going to say something which is very heretical, but it also happens, in my understanding, to be totally true. This country needs to shrink the City of London by a factor of 90%. The argument that the City of London is good for this country is a complete and utter fallacy. It is a drag on the rest of the economy. It is pushing productivity down. It is making Britain into what it has now become in the last 20, 30 years after financialization went crazy.
And it's turning London into Notting Hill.
It's turning London...
as seen in the film.
The movie,
yeah.
And so the argument that the city has to be competitive and it must accumulate capital, it's exactly the opposite of what is true. So you need fewer banks, fewer bankers. They are effectively a sinkhole that absorbs and extracts value from the rest of the economy. And the result is that the majority of the people are not left behind. They are held behind by financialization. It is preposterous that the asset books of the City of London contain loans that are 5 times your GDP. This is something that you should look at as a threat to the cohesion and future of this country.
The city is the problem, then where is the answer? Where is the money for the Green New Deal, for instance?
Well, one place is tax havens. One of the really big problems we face is that so much of the money that moves around England doesn't ever get taxed, particularly the money of the very wealthy like that. Another place is this ridiculous thing of high-frequency trading, where money is being created in nanoseconds. Why isn't that would be a very simple thing to restrain, at least. There are many ways, I think, that we could be looking at the flow of money and seeing how we could make it fairer and more rational. But we're not doing it at the moment.
Well, there are 2 points also to add to this about the Green New Deal and how to finance it. The first one is a technical one. You don't need a financial center that has 5 times its GDP of money, of pieces of paper sloshing around, doing nothing productive. France, which is not in a great state of health either, has a much, much, much smaller financial sector, and average productivity is higher than 25% higher than Britain, and income per person is higher than Britain. So you don't need it. The financing of the Green New Deal will require taxing wealth, ending tax havens and so on. But that will really not be at all enough. Even if you introduce a wealth tax like the one that Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are proposing in the United States, all you'll be able to raise is about 1% of GDP. It's good, but it's not enough. We need 5, 6, 7% to have the green transition and the creation of the good quality jobs that we need in this country, in Europe, and so on. The main way of energizing this excess liquidity is what I referred to before. Public investment banks that issue bonds that operate like sponges, that soak up the liquidity from the real estate market, from the share buyback process, which is boosting share prices without any investment, without any good quality jobs, and the central banks just announcing to the markets that they will support the bonds issued by the public investment banks. That was the New Deal idea originally of Franklin Roosevelt.
Yep.
It's how he managed to prevent the perpetuation of the Great Depression in the United States, that basic public finance idea. But beyond that, we need to reconsider the model of capitalism that we have. Because think about it. Every time you use an app to buy a train ticket in this country, right? You know that 75p goes to Trainline. Trainline belongs to KKR. You've never heard of KKR. KKR owns Boots, the chemists. Did you know that? Did you know that behind the majority of the corporations and big banks like JP Morgan in the United States, Bank of America, US Bank, Walmart, and so on, there are 3 companies that you probably have never heard of: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. Have you heard of them? They own 70% of capitalism, right? And your little 75p every time you buy a train line ticket, yeah, sort of slashes around through there. So you have a situation where the railway system in Britain is siphoning anything between 170 and 200 million through the apps that you use to buy a train ticket. And that finds itself into the KKR tax havens of the Cayman Islands and so on and so forth. Now that effectively is think of it as a system of extracting value from the real economy and siphoning it off to create this, the super rich of 0.1%. As long as we keep doing this, there will be no Green New Deal, because those people will always own the media, will always own Facebook, or be able to to buy as many sponsored ads on Facebook to poison politics and to poison democracy. Unless we combine public financial tools that go back to have their roots in the New Deal of Roosevelt with a challenge to the property rights over apps, over Facebook, over railway systems, we are not going to be able to save the planet and create jobs that stop people from feeling so angry that they vote for Johnson and Farage.
Another thing to add to the Trainline story is that Trainline is owned by a nested series of 26 companies. So Trainline is owned by another company called Trainline HG, which is owned by another company called HG Holdings, so on and so on. There are 26 of these in a row. And why do companies do that, do you think? It's so that they can never be identified. Where the wealth is can never be pinned down, so they can never be taxed.
Is the solution to that global, national? Is that for a government to tackle? Is it for governments to tackle? Is it going back to organisations like, dare I say it, the G20, which are unwieldy, unlikely to make a big decision?
It's all of that. We have to act local, regional, in our neighbourhoods, everything. But it's a good start is to renationalise the railways.
Yeah.
And have an app that belongs to the National Railway Company. Yeah, it's a good start.
Can I say, another very good start would be to acknowledge the idea of the commons, that there are things that we share, there are things that should not be privatizable. We used to accept that until Thatcher, really, who came along with "there's no such thing as society," following in Ayn Rand's footsteps of altruism is evil, if you remember these 2 great statements of the 20th century. But those two ideas were really the basis upon which we dissolved the notion of the commons. The commons is not only to do with pieces of land. We know of that kind of commons where your sheep can graze, but it's to do with intellectual property. It's to do with a commons of knowledge. It's to do with shared resources. shared resources being not only physical things. So we have to start thinking of the flow of energy and wealth in a country, in a nation, as something that we have common interest in. It can't be just hived off and nested in a series of 26 companies and end up in Arkansas or wherever. Where are KKR? Somewhere like that, aren't they?
But what is interesting about KKR is they control 200 companies and have 4,500 companies registered in the Cayman Islands through which they control those 200 companies.
Uh-huh. And did you know that there's an address in Harley Street, number 29 Harley Street, which has 15,000 company headquarters at it? And if you call them, somebody will answer the phone and she'll say, sorry dear, I can't connect you with them. It's a completely fake address, but because England is now the money laundering capital of the world, it really is actually. We are the real criminals in this. That's what happens. You get 15,000.
This is not collective guilt, because
no,
the majority of the British
responsibility
people are the victims of the City of London.
Yeah.
There's so much to unpick there, and I know I'm not going to be able to unpick it all. I'm going to pick one small part, though. Do either of you accept, though, that profit and making money is a force for creativity?
It's not the primary force, I don't think. I don't know anybody who is excited about what they make because it's going to make them money. I know people who are excited about what they make and who would like to make money from it and are happy when they do. But I've never met anybody, in my business anyway, for whom that's the primary motive.
Happiness stems from creativity, from doing something creative, something worthy. And if you get some money for that as well, then you're the happiest person on earth. Mm. The trouble is that the connection between getting out of poverty and hard work has been broken, and the connection between doing something creative and making lots of money has been broken. This is the problem with capitalism. But allow me to just give you a little hint of how that has become a systemic failure. Karl Marx was talking about the class struggle in Manchester, how the capitalist is investing in a machine. The worker has no alternative but to work there, and the value of the labor power is lower than the value of the product. But now we've really moved to a science fiction version of this. Think about it. Imagine you're the CEO of a large company. Let's not mention one. You are beholden to the expectations of these KKRs and BlackRocks, because they own the companies that own the companies that own your shares. Okay? So whether you're going to get a bonus or whether you're going to be reappointed depends on those people. Okay? Pension funds, equity firms, private equity capital, and so on. The workers contribute as part of their pay as they earn to a pension fund. The pension fund then is owned or owns the company that effectively drives the CEO. The CEO, any CEO, if a CEO today wants to make a little bit more money, do you know what he has to do? It's usually he. You know what he has to do? Just announce that he's firing 30% of the workforce. It doesn't really matter whether this will reduce profits, increase profits, whether it makes financial sense, whether it's from an accounting perspective the right thing to do. Any CEO who announces a cull of the workforce will immediately get money. Why? Because the stock exchange immediately reacts to news of redundancies by boosting the price of the shares. A boost in the price of the shares always transmits into a boost of the bonuses of the CEO. So think about this. This is an evil plan, really. I mean, it's a very clever plan, but nobody planned it. It's something that evolved spontaneously within monopoly capitalism. The worker pays part of his wage into a pension fund, which then demands of the CEO that the worker is fired so that the share goes up. Beautiful, isn't it?
It's a circle. I want to, just a couple of things before we open it up to everybody here who've been busy washing glasses. You haven't noticed they were there. One is this idea of the worker, of capital, linking back through, we talked about climate change. I wonder whether you think a lot of this could be made redundant, first by the changes that climate change may bring, and secondly by AI. People are talking about hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs, white-collar jobs, blue-collar jobs, because of AI, the driverless car, the law firm that can, look at contracts simply by putting them through a computer. The sort of the joining of those two events, how dangerous is that? Are we even thinking about how they might interact?
Some people are. There's a very interesting new book by Stuart Russell, just came out, which is about the more dystopian possibilities of AI. I can't remember the name at the moment, I'm afraid. But the interesting thing about AI is that really we should call it machine learning.
Yes.
AI is a different thing. We haven't actually got to much of that yet. It's machine learning, and machine learning is looking at lots and lots of data and finding patterns that aren't intuitive, that aren't obvious without a machine learning system, and then trying to create responses based on that. And it would be very interesting if we said to a machine learning system, what should we do about climate change? If we trusted it enough to actually take its results seriously. Because I think it would be revolutionary if we did accept that we were now in a position where our own intuition was not sufficiently evolved to deal with this very complex and big problem, and that we needed that kind of help. I'd like to see the results of that. What I think is happening now is that we're moving into a sort of non-intuitive phase of our history. The complexity that we're dealing with is so rich, and as any of you who know about chaos theory will understand, the number of outcomes, the number of possible outcomes is so large that we need help in dealing with this. We can get that help by crowdsourcing, by trusting each other's opinions and amassing them and looking at how well the data is being digested. But we could also do it, I think, somewhat with machine learning. I'm alone among my friends in this, because most of them deeply distrust it, but I'm alone among my friends in also thinking that we should be now looking at nuclear power as a serious... We were talking earlier about, you were mentioning lignite, the Germans using lignite. Why are the Germans using lignite, the dirtiest fuel on the planet? Because unfortunately, the German Greens persuaded them to shut down their nuclear power stations.
It wasn't a good German Greens. Angela Merkel deciding like that after Fukushima, that she would get more votes if she shut them down.
Yeah, maybe.
The Greens had no influence.
Yeah.
Because Angela Merkel,
they were very happy. They were happy to support her.
Opportunism.
Yeah, but they were happy to support it.
Look, remember we were having a chat backstage beforehand, and we said that we were asked, do you disagree on anything? And we couldn't find anything to disagree. Here we found something to disagree on. I'm against nuclear power. And you know why? Not just because of the fact that we don't know what to do with nuclear waste, but primarily cost. You're right. 10 years ago, when Merkel made that choice, it was a mistake from a climate change perspective. But now, to start designing and building nuclear power stations, irrelevant. The cost and efficiency of wind and solar has become so wonderful. I mean, let me give you an example.
Are you aware of the land area involved to try to replace coal power? It's not a question. I thoroughly agree with you. I would live in a renewable world.
The capacity to have floating solar panels and wind turbines that will produce 100% of energy within the next 5 years around the world. This is now clearly feasible with existing technology, not with your.
We have to look at the arithmetic of this.
Yeah, we've looked at the arithmetic. I mean, people have looked at the arithmetic. Okay, look, we are disagreeing on something. But let me go to the key question about AI and the singularity moment that people talk about. That there will come a moment very soon, maybe 6 months to 2 years, when the number of jobs created by the new technology is going to be far, far less than the number of jobs that will be destroyed, because every technological innovation destroyed jobs. But up until now, it has been creating more jobs than it has been destroying. And now the singularity moment is when AI will destroy 45% of professions all in 1 year or two.
And I'm going to interject, and at the same time, you might get mass migrations of people leaving areas that are no longer inhabitable because it's too hot, too dry,
That is
it's
correct.
flooded.
That's correct. So here is the thing from where I'm standing. Given the exponential growth of productivity of capital, of machines, machine learning, robots, and so on and so forth, capitalism is going to run out of path. Because, in a sense, with private property rights over the robots concentrated on such a small percentage of the population, you're going to have a society that can produce all sorts of goodies, but there will be no demand for them because the masses of people will not be able to afford them. So what you're going to have is a situation where you are never going to get full automation. You're going to have a dual economy. You're going to have fully robotized plants. Already we have. Like if you go to the Apple manufacturing plant near Austin, Texas, that produces all the MacBooks, there are hardly any workers. And at the same time, you're going to have areas where people work like machines with very little mechanization, because human labor will be so dirt cheap, almost slavery, that there will be no economic reason to introduce robots. So we're going to have this kind of awfulness. The only solution I can see to this, in order to turn the robots into humanity's slaves, rather than allowing them to turn most humans into the slaves of the robots and of the owners of the robots, is to have a situation where a percentage of the shares, we can start with 10% of the shares of corporations with more than 500 employees, go to a sovereign wealth fund. I would like it to be a global one. And all the dividends accumulate in there. And that becomes a fund from which you disperse a small, initially, universal basic dividend, not income. To the extent that capital, machinery, to think of the Google engine. Every time you search something in the Google engine, you're contributing to the capital of Google, but you're not taking any of the profits. The profits are privatized. So the capital is socially produced, the profits go directly to the shareholders only of Google. So imagine if we said, look, folks, if you really want to be listed in the stock exchange and you have the license to operate and so on, 10% of your shares will have to go to a common kitty, to the commons. And then the dividends that accumulate there are divided. And as AI progresses and robotization progresses, we can go from 10% to 20% to 30%. In the limit, you have market communism. Because if that goes to 100%, all the corporations are owned by everyone, all the dividends accumulate to everyone, but you still have markets functioning. So we're not talking about going to Soviet-style failed communist experiments, but we're talking about a completely different way of combining commons with entrepreneurship, with technology. And then, if we are, as the demos, the owners of capital, then you can direct it towards the green transition practices that will save the planet.
That's a huge thought. I'm going to put it out there. There were so many huge thoughts. And I know it may not have seemed like it, but I was desperately trying to keep my mouth shut. There were so many things I wanted to ask. But I'm going to let you do some of the asking now. So please ask brief questions so we can get as many in as possible. There are people wandering around with panels. If you're upstairs, there are a couple of mics on either side. So I think probably come up to the front, perhaps in queue near the mics. That might be the quickest way. And basically, I'll take 3 at a time, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Is that all right?
Fine.
Right. Let's go to number 3 at the front here. Let's take the gentleman there.
Sure. So my question is 2 parts, really. I mean, I just think that surely social media badly misnamed, kind of very much gives the illusion of engagement. And what's exciting about what's happening in Britain today, as Yanis referred to, is the return of actual activity of people on the ground. And surely we need to do more on the ground in the community, rebuilding social activity. And also, in relation to this, what our Parliament has done in recent months is what it should do. It's taken heed of the split in society and continues the debate. That's what's exciting. There needs to be more activity by ordinary people on the ground, more rebuilding of structures on the ground, and that's what will lead to fighting for more progressive ideas in society.
Okay. Number one at the back there.
Thank you. Yes, two related questions. About the Green New Deal and how it would be funded. When you, Yanis, have talked about the funding before, you've talked about the European Central Bank, which would obviously fund bonds in euros. Now, how does that work for us who are outside the Eurozone? And I hate to shudder to think of it, but we might be outside the EU when that comes about. And secondly, so I'd just like to work out how that actually works for us in Britain. But secondly, the other thing as well, would you agree that this funding through bonds, the bond issue, is also a kind of has a democratic bonus to it as well? Because I have a friend who's an Indian who remembers the times immediately after independence in India, and the Indian government issued a massive bond issue, and it had a real feel of people power about it. Everybody took out their savings and bought bonds in the government because they wanted to participate in the whole process of a lovely new independent India. And could we see the same sort of thing happening right across Europe, of people buying into the Green New Deal in that way?
Okay, and I'm going to come down to the front, woman there, just there. Yeah.
Hello, good evening. Just would like you to comment on movements and radical change. I'd like to mention two very important ones, the BDS and extinction, and what is missing.
Okay. Right. Are you happy? Do you want me to repeat them? Is everyone happy?
No, I think we got them.
Brian, do you want to go first? Take as much or as little as you want.
Social media, okay. Which I, of course, call anti-social media because it's been so disastrous, I think, as an experiment in sort of unchecked, unplanned, unthought out capitalism, essentially. You know, it's a great way of making money, as you can see.
She says, opening her iPad.
Well, I don't actually have any social media accounts myself, and I don't plan to, so I don't know if that makes me a Luddite or if it turns out to be rather smart. And I know that a lot of people I know are now abandoning their social media accounts.
But I think the questioner was also saying what we're also seeing is real activism,
Yes.
a renewed kind of people on the street, literally.
Yes. Yanis said something earlier which I am very attuned to, which is the notion that what we've been doing for 40 years is privatizing the profits and socializing the costs. Unfortunately, social media has become another version of that. All of the activity, the work, is done by us. All of the profits are taken by Mark Zuckerberg and a couple of others. I don't think social media are useless at all, and I think they're going to be very important. At the moment, I think it's one of those commons that we have to take over again. It cannot be run by private companies. It just will not produce the kind of results that it needs to produce. I don't know what you feel about.
Obviously. Well, look, I think that we need to look at what the Chinese are doing. Not copy it, for God's sakes, but look at it. Because what the Communist Party is doing there is saying, okay, Twitter out, Facebook out, we're going to create our own versions, and anyone who does not, any of the business people who are running those social media, who do not conform to the standards of society, are going to be expropriated. Now, I wouldn't want the Communist Party to decide who gets expropriated and who doesn't. But imagine if it was a citizens' assembly process that determined whether the social medium that belongs to the commons changes its bosses because they have misbehaved. That would be something I can easily live with. Now, let me answer your questions about the Green New Deal. Of course, the European Central Bank cannot back British green investment bonds. But imagine if the Bank of England, which is your central bank, and the ECB forge an alliance. They do it all the time. But they only do it in favor of banks, not the green transition of the people. So they could have announce an alliance. And the alliance would be for the purposes of funding a Green New Deal in Britain, in Sweden, in Germany, in Italy, in Turkey. We can expand the limits of the EU without even expanding the EU. Because you can co-opt these different countries, even if they're not in the EU or even if they have left the EU. Hint, hint. And you have the public investment banks issuing the bonds collaboratively. So the European Investment Bank, the German Investment Bank, the British Investment Bank, if you manage to create one, or Germany manages to create one, and the central banks also join this alliance. Then you would have a big bazooka against climate change. You would be able to have a substantial amount of money that you throw directly into renewables and directly into AI that is going to be used for good purpose, electrification across Europe, and effectively creating fantastic jobs for the people in Britain, and that would create also synergies.
And I think it would actually result in the more optimistic projections that you
then
made.
you would get a feeling of patriotism. If you have 1,000 quid or 10,000 quid or 30,000 quid, what's the point of putting it in Lloyd's Bank or Barclays Bank when you get no interest and you pay fees and so on? If this bond system returns a decent interest rate yield, which it will, if it is invested in real productive capacity, then that's why the bankers will fight this tooth and nail. As for movements, I think you should answer this question, and BDS in particular.
Before we came on, I said there are two subjects that if they come up, we'll never get off them: Brexit and BDS.
I'll let you speak briefly then on answering this question, and then we can move on.
Okay. First of all, I should say what BDS is for the benefit of those who don't know. It means boycott, divestments and sanctions, and it particularly applies to the cultural boycott of Israeli government-supported culture. It's the one thing that has completely unified the Palestinians, who, 99% of them support BDS and ask us, foreign artists, to observe BDS. It's, as far as I'm concerned, a question of judgment. There are good arguments for saying that the existence of BDS hardens resistance to change in Israel. I think they are some quite good arguments. There are also good arguments, and I err on this side, for saying that BDS is the only thing that the Israeli government has ever felt threatened by. And this seems to me to be fairly obvious, in that they now have a special department in government to deal with it, and they work very hard to discredit it. I'm not going to talk any more about BDS because it is such a complicated subject, and we could be here all night. What was the other one?
Extinction Rebellion was the other movement.
Well, that's a great thing to see. I'm very happy Extinction Rebellion exists. I want to see movements of that kind happening at every social level. I don't expect to see 60 or 70-year-old university professors going out with doing the same kind of movement, but I hope they do a movement. I hope they make a movement. And I think, as Yanis said, that what we're seeing now in England for the first time since I was quite young is a society that is engaged in a commitment to change of some kind.
Can I say a few words about BDS as well, because this is important, especially amongst our comrades in Germany. I worry about BDS, even though I support it. And I worry because it's so easy for anti-Semitism to seep into any movement like that. And I would prefer to, die in a ditch, have you heard that expression? Than to be associated with anti-Semites, or to be in a movement that is easily infiltrated by anti-Semites. But then, we have to balance that fear with another fear, the fear of forgetting the Palestinians and, just leaving them to ethnic cleansing and this, crime against their human rights, which is happening under the express policy of apartheid by especially, the recent Israeli government. So how do you balance the need to prevent anti-Semitism from seeping in with the need to fight against apartheid? When there was apartheid in South Africa, BDS was strong. I used to live in this country back then. We used to demonstrate against apartheid, and we used to call upon Thatcher to impose boycotts on Barclays Bank, on all the companies that were, functioning in South Africa and so on. That was not against the South African people, whether they were black or against them. It was against apartheid. So the £1 trillion question is, how can we combine boycotting apartheid while being solidaristic to the Jews who feel threatened by anti-Semitism? That is the question.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots there that I know is fantastically controversial. And perhaps
the easiest defense against BDS is to say it's anti-Semitic. Yeah. And that's the defense that the Israeli government always uses. So it's always tried to make BDS look like an anti-Semitic movement. It's the same technique that's been used against Corbyn, of course. That is one way of weakening somebody, because that's such a fractious area to talk about.
Okay, I am actually going to move away from this because it is
I'm glad
controversial,
you are. Thank
and
you.
there is so much.
We don't move away from controversy.
Well, because I want to get some more questions in. Otherwise, we can just spend the rest of the time talking about it. I'm going to go upstairs this time. So there's a woman in the red jumper there. If you want to come down to that microphone down there, thank you.
I suspect you guys both agree that we are going through a major transition as a society and as a world, really. And technology has generally seems to have been the cusp of these big transitions. How do we get better at reinventing ourselves? How do we get better at this process of constantly transitioning to V2.0, 3.0, to become better as societies? Because I feel like every time we have to go through it, it's because there's a lot of pain, there's a war, there's angst that leads to it. And so how do we start to learn from this process of reinvention and get better and get processes in place that allow us to do it peacefulully and equitably?
Okay. Thank you.
And then on this side, there's a gentleman there. If you want to step up to the microphone, if you're on the balcony and you want to ask a question, there are microphones on either side.
Hey there. Apologies for the slightly boring question on this one, but what do you think on the ECB's policy of prolonged negative interest rates and what effect that's having on the everyday person? Do you think it's good or bad? And ultimately, what do you think can be done practically for the ECB to come out of this cycle of just continually cutting rates every time there's some sort of economic, worry, if that's what needs to do?
Okay, and one more up there.
Thank you. So my question is specifically relating to companies such as Google and Facebook, and given the extremely sensitive situation with regards to our private data and privacy, what do you think will constitute the individual's freedom and integrity in a place where effectively all your opinions and everything, all your preferences are known to the companies before they're even known to you? Thank you.
Okay, so we're in the midst of a transition. How can we use technology to reinvent ourselves and become better? I think the ECB and negative interest rates is definitely one for you, Yanis. And data and privacy, have we given away our freedom and privacy? Where are we left as individuals?
Well, to the first question, you have to remember that everything to do with the internet came out of a kind of stew of utopianism that brewed up on the West Coast in the 80s and 90s. And it really was a very utopian vision. Suddenly we'll all be able to talk to each other what could be better? There's going to be world peace immediately. I was part of this and even believed it for a few weeks as well. So sort of about 1989 to...
5 minutes.
You know, it seemed like, what could go wrong? Suddenly we can all communicate. All of those barriers that have been keeping us apart, geographical and cultural and so on, they're going to disappear. We didn't see the other side of it at all, I think. I think people, Jaron Lanier was one of the first people to start seeing it in the 90s. He started saying, this doesn't look so good. And of course, the person who saw it most was Evgeny Morozov, who wrote that great book called The Net Delusion.
Oh, yes.
And the second book was called To Save Everything, Click Here. They're both brilliant books. But nonetheless, California carried on with the myth, you know, imagine the future, it's yours, sort of thing. But I think what we could do in future is perhaps proceed a little bit more slowly and not proceed at the breakneck speed that was predicated entirely by the fact that there was a race going on between these companies to claim as much territory as they could. You know, it was a real sort of arms struggle going on. There's a great graphic going around at the moment on the internet showing the last 20 years of the internet and the primacy of different companies. And you see them gulping each other. The process was nothing whatsoever to do with social well-being. Nobody in that process was thinking about that. They were thinking about territory. We want the biggest possible audience. We want the maximum number of eyes. So it was to do with advertising, essentially, because that is, after all, what the internet is paid for by. So can we perhaps in the future not have it dominated by advertising? You know, again, this has to be thought of as a commons, I think. And if it's a commons, it's beholden to a citizens' assembly of some kind. It has to share our intentions and our needs as well.
Okay, and I wonder if you wanted to also talk about possibly our relationship with freedom and privacy specifically. Have we just given that away?
Well, you have. I didn't sign up.
We did.
Yanis.
Yeah. Well, firstly, on the question of reinventing ourselves and getting better, well, first thing we must not do is indulge in self-help books and that culture of, you know, voluntarism, where we are going to do a little bit of recycling and feel that we've done our thing. This is a collective enterprise. We must get together and form movements and, reinvent ourselves through democratic participation.
Part of that is actually, as you say, not taking responsibility for something we are not responsible for. You know, there are processes that produced this situation, and they weren't of our choice, actually. So to sort of take all the blame on yourself and say, I have to improve my life, that's a bit of martyrdom that you don't need to do, really.
Exactly. And because you had an American accent, didn't you? It gave me a couple of ideas. Well, we need to borrow ideas from interesting social experiments and economic experiments. Allow me to say that I'm a great believer in restructuring our socioeconomic mode of production along the lines of NFL, the National Football League. Let me make the point here. Let me remind or tell those who don't know of it that the NFL is a very strange competition. So, when it comes at the end of the season or the beginning, between seasons, to replenish their talent, their player stock, the worst team gets the best available free player. Similarly, in Major League Baseball, you have a salary cap, and teams that pay more than a certain amount, they have to pay 40% tax to the teams that don't have enough money to pay salaries. Okay? That's a kind of socialism. Mm-hmm. Effectively, what you're doing is you're redistributing to the weakest. Why? Because competition is much more interesting when you don't have Google and Facebook, you know, and Walmart destroying everybody else. So, you know, how about reinventing society by combining wonderful socialistic ideas with the National Football League? And finally, on this issue, again, because of your American accent, I'm going to give an American example. Don't call those who vote for racists, racist or deplorables. It is not a good idea. So, I'm not being Christian here, but you've got to understand those who voted for Trump, or for Brexit, for Farage, whatever, okay? You've got to try to get into their shoes, not in order to be converted to their way of thinking. But, you know, when you hear a blue-collar worker in Minnesota, wherever, refer to Latinos or Mexicans as rapists because they heard Trump say that. These are not merely bad people. They're people in despair. Because if you look at the social statistics in the United States, also in the United Kingdom, you know, watch any Ken Loach movie if you don't need to read statistics, okay? What you find in the United States, you have blue-collar workers that have lost their job in a mass layoff. They are completely hopeless, and they have to go through the indignity. Whereas these are the people, the very same people that used to call welfare queens the black women who were on welfare, they have to go and register as disabled people because the only way of getting some benefits is to pretend to be disabled. At that point, the moment they become welfare recipients, the people that used to call welfare recipients welfare queens, suddenly it's not enough to call welfare queens the blacks and the Latinos. They have to call them scum, rapists. They have to... And you don't have to agree with them, you don't have to like them, but you have to understand them. And you have to explain to them the circumstances that led them to this, that this is not the Latinos, and it's not the blacks, but it is capital. It is Wall Street. It is Obama's reappointment of Tim Geithner, you know, to take America out of the post-crash period by effectively refloating the bankers who brought that disaster upon those very same people. On the question of the...
Negative interest rates.
Negative interest rates. Look, it's like, you know, blaming the messenger. It's like shooting the messenger. The European Central Bank sets negative interest for one very simple reason. You have a mountain of savings and liquidity and very little investment. So think of it as demand and supply. When supply is huge and demand is low, supply of money, demand of money is investment, supply of money is liquidity available. What happens when supply far exceeds demand? The price keeps falling. Unlike potato markets and markets for cars and so on, in the money market, the price of money, which is the interest rate, keeps falling. Supply will not be eliminated because investment will not pick up. Investors think, oh, the interest rate is going down. So if I borrow money to invest, that would be great. But that's not what they think. You know what they think? When they hear the ECB is reducing interest, they say, oh my God, Mario Draghi thinks, you know, the future is going to be shit. So I better not invest. So the problem gets worse. What is the solution? The Green New Deal, funded by bonds from the European Investment Bank and the other investment banks with the ECB. So I'm not going to repeat it. I've already said it.
Do you know this idea of demurrage currencies?
Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting idea. Demurrage currency is a currency that actually earns negative interest. So the longer you keep it, the less valuable it becomes. And it's an experiment that has been tried a few times, and I think rather...
You need electronic money for that.
Yeah, well,
the only way is to ban cash. And that becomes a very big thing. I am all in favor of it. But the solution is not the negative interest. The solution is to take the excess liquidity and invest it into the things that humanity needs.
Yes, but the thing about demurrage currencies is they encourage that because it's to your advantage to keep it
They
moving.
encourage spending, which is not the same thing as investing in the things we need. You know, markets. I don't trust markets.
Really?
No, I've never seen a market that I can trust. As for the big tech question, it's really very simple. Change property rights. Again, I'm going back to that issue of changing property rights. You know, I'm an old Marxist. All the things, you know, I'm just against a situation where the means and the tools of our reproduction are owned by the very few. So now data is a means. It should be returned. Well, I'm not here. Look, I'm just becoming a convert to private property. Make it genuine private property. You know, your data should belong to you and to no one else. And put this in law.
Yeah, well, this is the experiment the city of Barcelona is trying now, isn't it? Yeah, that's right.
Ownership of your own data. It's 8:29. One more? One more?
Okay.
Are you all right, guys? All right, so I'm going to take, there's one up there, and I'm going to take one at the back there, and that's a lot. Yes, lady there. Do you want to do the one at the back first? Yes, because you're right near. Keep it brief, and I'm going to ask these guys to keep it brief too.
You've given us a lot of information tonight. Thank you very much. And I want to ponder about the democratization of information flows and the role of WikiLeaks in democratizing information flows about money and power. And I'd like to hear your opinion about the threats to Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, and his potential US extradition in Trump's America. Thank you.
That's going to be brief. Gentleman up there.
Just a very, very quick one. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the back catalogue of Roxy Music, but there's someone, I'm guessing both of you gentlemen here are familiar with, is Nicholas Shaxson.
Yes,
and his
The
book,
Finance Curse.
Finance Curse, yes.
Yeah.
I'm just halfway through it at the moment.
It's a great book.
Yeah, but I was wondering, the vast majority of my friends in London are of the opinion that the City of London creates an awful lot of tax revenue and delivers it to the rest of the country. It's an exporter to the rest of the country tax revenue. However, if one accepts the premises of the book, all they're doing is destroying wealth, and their profits of destroying that wealth, they're giving a few small crumbs back, which I think is probably the truth. Sure. But unfortunately, the vast majority of the people in the United Kingdom, perhaps in the West, think that the huge financial markets are forces for good, and that they work in this free market, which is a great thing. How are you going to disavow them of that?
Okay, that view. We're going to have to do this really quickly, I'm sorry, because we are really over time now. So your thoughts on Julian Assange and the role of financial markets. Two big questions, I totally accept.
We both know Julian, and we both visited him when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, several times each, I guess. And it was certainly a form of torture. And he's now in an even worse form of torture. He's in solitary confinement. Yanis talked to him very recently. He's quite ill. So whatever you think about Julian Assange and what he did, this is not what he deserves. He's being tortured, essentially.
When I was a young person, like I think most of us, upon reading 1984, Orwell's 1984, I was terrified because I could see that this was coming. Big Brother was coming. The technology would always improve. And who's going to have it? Big Brother. And we will be under surveillance. The first time I felt a glimmer of hope that this can be reversed was when I read about the work of Julian Assange, even before he started WikiLeaks. And his great, brilliant idea was to use Big Brother's technology, to turn it into a digital mirror and turn it towards Big Brother so the rest of us can see what Big Brother is doing. The reason why Julian is now in Belmarsh prison, 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, which is something that is not even done to the worst multiple murderers in this country. Every day, 23 hours a day, he's in solitary. He has 1 hour a day. It's because he exposed the crimes against humanity that were performed in our name, in the name of the West, in Iraq, here, there, in Tunisia, and so on and so forth. That is the only reason. And I think that those progressives who have every reason to be critical of some of Julian's choices, as I was, regarding seeing Nigel Farage supporting Trump, in the faint hope that maybe he would be released from his predicament. They should apologize to their own conscience for spending the last 7-8 years saying that he is running away from a rape charge, when it is absolutely abundantly clear that there was never such a charge, and all that is going on is he is meant to effectively perish in a supermax prison in the United States of America for embarrassing the national security apparatus.
I know there's lots of things in there to unpick, and it's quite difficult to move on, but I am going to make you move on because we are over time. Just very briefly then, this question of the financial markets, it's clear that neither of you are particularly fans of the City of London. How do you convince people in the UK who believe actually that the wealth that's created in the city flows to the citizens?
I just would like to add something to what Yanis said. There's another organisation which is turning a mirror, using the same technology to turn a mirror back onto power, and that's an organisation based in London called Forensic Architecture. They're based at Goldsmiths, and if you don't know about them, really have a look at them. They're the most interesting group of people doing fascinating work using quite complex data analysis to tell the true story of some things that governments have been lying about for some time. So I just want to tell you about that in case you don't know about it. As for the City of London, well, first of all, the notion that they're paying lots and lots of taxes is almost laughable because they are the biggest of all the tax cheats in the world. So they're not actually contributing even on that level very much. The other problem is that they suck out so much talent. It's like the Department of Defense in its relationships to scientists. Do you know the huge percentage of British scientists work for the Department of Defense? What are they doing? We don't really know, but that talent is actually, as I mentioned earlier, is communally nurtured. It's the product of our society and our education system and so on and so on. And
Can I say it's worse than the Department of Defense? Because the Department of Defense, they do some actual innovations, which eventually, you know, like the internet came out of the American Department of Defense. But these people are pushing paper around. All they're doing is creating more complicated forms of debt. There is no social value whatsoever in what they're doing. Zero. The only innovation that has come out of the financial sector was the ATM.
And on that positive thought, I'm afraid I'm going to leave it there because we are over time and out of time. Thank you.